My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing PT 109, the 1963 World War II drama about John F. Kennedy's exploits on the high seas.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear
that you will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of your ability,
to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today from an undisclosed location in California is Jim Robinson, who's learning how to communicate via coconut. Jim, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Gary, and I might try that coconut sending out of an SOS message if someone would rescue me from California.
Okay. Understood. Understood.
Gary, I do want to say that this is an exciting day in our podcast because finally we are talking about your all-time favorite U.S. president, John F. Kennedy. That's a joke, folks.
That's a joke, yes. Well, he's actually right. So this actually goes to our experience, talking about our experiences with the guy. For both of us, I think he was probably our first president. I at least don't remember Eisenhower at all, but I remember JFK very vividly. I assume the same with you?
Yeah, I remember a couple news reports on in the background in our living room mentioning a President Eisenhower, but nothing beyond that. It was really Kennedy.
Yeah. I grew up in Massachusetts, so John F. Kennedy was a very big deal, like a god almost. And everything that he did was magnified there. It's like like it is with the Red Sox now. All of a sudden you can't get inescapable. The Red Sox are inescapable, and the Patriots. And now it was just like that with the Kennedys. So,
well, what was it like being from a good, traditional Republican family growing up in Massachusetts, in the shadow of all those Kennedys? That must have been quite a fun experience.
It was torture. Yeah. Politics wasn't as vicious though as it was now.
Right.
So, we were Republicans in a very Democratic city, and it was, we had lots of Democratic friends, and you didn't sit around and argue about politics all the time. I mean, it didn't intrude on our lives like it does now.
Well, you didn't sit around deciding who you wouldn't be friends with,
right?
Simply because of their party affiliation.
So I can only go. I mean, one of my earliest memories, the one we always talk about, is when Kennedy was assassinated, and that was when I was, what was that, 63, 9 years old. So that was a traumatic experience. So, my memories are really only those first 3 years that he was president.
How did you find out about the assassination?
Oh, yeah. This is the one story that we have told for our entire lives. I came out of school in the 4th grade, and just someone told me that Kennedy had been shot, and I said, which one? Because there were a million Kennedys, and they said President Kennedy, and I, ran home and turned on the TV, and there it was. I mean, it was terrible.
Well, we were ending the school day at that time because, we were on the East Coast, so it was an hour later.
Right.
And school was just about over, and I remember we were sort of milling around, I don't know, waiting to go into phys ed or something. And I saw clusters of teachers standing at different places, different corners of the school, sort of whispering very quietly. And then they told us all to go home. And the students all walked, to home. And I didn't actually know what was happening till I walked into my house. And my mother told me. And it was, my mother was just torn up. And she was a conservative Republican. I mean, she was crying.
Yeah.
So it was it was really a harrowing experience. We had to wait in my family to be bedeviled by the Kennedys. We had to wait a few more years compared to you because I grew up in New York.
Right.
And it was in 1964 when once again, the sophisticated New Yorkers got bamboozled out of one of their Senate seats by somebody who didn't live there, Bobby Kennedy. Hillary Clinton would do that later on. And it was the first time I ever heard my father use an expletive, the S as in Sam word,
Yeah.
when it came over the news that Bobby Kennedy had beaten Senator Kenneth Keating and taken the New York Senate seat.
Well, I will just say that Bobby Kennedy had a more right to run for senator from New York than John Kennedy did from Massachusetts, because the Kennedys grew up in New York. I mean, they really
That's
don't
true.
have a deep relationship with Massachusetts. They moved there when they were all kids, and they grew up in New York, and I think that's why their accents are so crazy, because people don't talk like the Kennedys in Massachusetts. That is a completely foreign accent, unique to them.
It is so pronounced too. I mean, that accent. And but I have to say, we talked in a previous podcast about how the 1960 campaign was our first campaign at age 6, and one we were invested in and rooting for Nixon and all that. And I have to say, though, as the years have gone on and I've studied the history more, my view about John Kennedy has softened actually significantly, policy-wise, because the more I look at the history, the more I see him as more of a continuum from Eisenhower, with the real breaking point coming with his assassination.
Yeah.
The real start of the 60s, the start of LBJ and the Great Society. Kennedy was, I think, a much more mainstream kind of person politically. I mean, if nothing else, in foreign policy, where he ran to the right of Richard Nixon in the campaign.
I think you're probably right. My view of the Kennedys has been colored so much by what came afterwards, that I will say for myself that I never personally hated John Kennedy like I really could not stand Bobby Kennedy, and of course Ted Kennedy was the devil. But the whole Kennedy miasma in Massachusetts is just so overwhelming. I've never told you this story. When I was in Sunday school, one Sunday they decided to have us write down on a piece of paper who the top 5 most important people in the entire world were. And this is Sunday school. And so I wrote down Jesus and St. Paul and Lincoln and someone else, and fine. I think that what they really wanted to find out is if everyone would write down Jesus. And I looked over what other kids were writing down, and some of them were writing down Kennedy. Like John Kennedy, one of the 5 most important people in the entire history of the world. Now, that's what it was like growing up in Massachusetts.
Well, now I understand. But what happened after, of course, it's natural with the lionization.
Right.
That he could do no wrong because the death was so tragic. And it did seem to be an inflection point in modern history. But just the things that were piled onto the myth making.
Yeah.
People talk about Camelot. Camelot was never even used until after he died. So
Right.
This was added on mythology. And then I think it was Arthur Schlesinger wrote a book about Bobby Kennedy, where he actually used the words, and Bobby Kennedy appeared on Earth in the year, and they, almost like it was a Jesus figure appearing on the earth. And then with Chappaquiddick, how that was simply another tragedy facing the Kennedy family, as if there was some kind of moral equivalence between that and the death of JFK. It did get to a point of complete ridiculousness,
Right.
But we can forget, because of that he was very popular overall most of his term as president. Those were the days, as you mentioned, where there was less fierce partisanship about presidents while they were president.
Well, yeah, I mean, like he was a big figure in popular culture, in part because there were so many of them, and um, did you have the Von Meter album where
yes.
so
Oh, absolutely. It
someone, this Von Meter guy was
was like a Rich Little of the time.
yeah, they did two albums where he played Kennedy on the album. It was a comedy album, and it was very funny. And
It was good, lighthearted humor with, little jabs here and there. Scenarios like Jackie Kennedy calling and ordering a pizza. And they asked, well, where do you want it delivered? And she said 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And the first album won Album of the Year at the Grammys in 1963.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I so PT 109 was one of my first memories about Kennedy. I have a book about presidents that my mother gave me when I was in the second grade, and it has all these little anecdotes. And the story about JFK was about PT 109. So I've been interested in this story for as long as I can remember, and not really knowing about it. So it's been lodged in my brain as something I wanted to know about, and I'm glad that we had a chance to watch this movie because I get it. And then I unfortunately I went down a PT 109 rabbit hole. And if I have this terrible tendency, which my mother has been telling me about since I was like 4 years old, like, don't tell everyone everything you know in an obnoxious detail. So if I start doing that today, let me know. But I went back and read some books, and now I know I'm an expert in PT 109.
So you never seen it before?
No, I've never seen it before, and you hadn't either, I assume.
Well, no, I vaguely remember it being on TV at some point when I was a kid. I didn't see it in the theaters, and I fully expected, upon my recent viewing, I expected to be bored. And I expected to have it be sort of cringeworthy and schlocky and straining too hard to draw parallels between what he did then and how, oh, look how he treated his crew. And doesn't that mean he'd be a great president? But it didn't really do that. So I wasn't bored. It was 2 hours and 20 minutes long,
yeah,
and
right.
I wasn't bored.
All right. Well, we'll talk about that later.
Why don't you summarize the plot for us?
I will summarize the plot. Yes. I hope my summary is short enough. So, it's a surprisingly simple story. The movie begins in 1943, which is right in the middle of World War II, with Navy Lieutenant John F. Kennedy being transported to the South Pacific, where he's been given command of a PT boat. During the course of the conversations, it transpires that Lieutenant Kennedy is a person of extreme privilege and the author of a book about geopolitical policy. Already at 25, he'd published a book. But instead of using his privilege to get out of the service, like some former presidents we could name, he's pulled strings to get into one of the most dangerous but glamorous assignments in the Navy. When he gets there, he meets his antagonist, an old school, by the book, cranky Commander Ritchie, who appears to be Kennedy's commanding officer, even though he's listed in the credits as the head of maintenance. Either way, Ritchie has contempt for the Harvard man Kennedy, but can't find anything wrong with his performance because Kennedy's an outstanding officer. He whips his PT boat and a crew into shape. The men respect him because he's calm, fair, and modest. Kennedy and his men take the boat out a few times, and each time they go out, they're shot at by the Japanese, which is kind of unlucky. On the night of August 7th, 1943, 16 PT boats are assigned to go out under the cover of darkness and disrupt a Japanese Navy convoy that is restocking an enemy base not too far away. And during this mission, PT 109 is run over and sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer, killing 2 of the boat's 13 crew. The remaining 11 crew members managed to climb aboard the wreckage of the PT 109, and after some hemming and hawing, Kennedy convinces them to swim 3 miles to the nearest island. 5 days pass on the island with some internal drama, but Kennedy keeps the crew's spirits alive until two armed local islanders come upon them and agree to take a message to a nearby outpost. There's no paper or pens, so Kennedy famously carves a message in a coconut, which the locals deliver, after which the rescue is effected. The movie ends with Kennedy refusing an offer to return to the States. Instead, he's assigned to another PT boat, and 5 of his crew show up voluntarily to serve under him again. So that was, did I miss anything?
No, I think you got it just right. Obviously, you described the script as written by Joe Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. That's just joking. But what we learn about this movie is that the fine hand of the Kennedys is all over it.
Yeah.
It's amazing that this movie came out in 1963, just as he was gearing up for his reelection bid. And it wasn't a movie to be shown at a convention. It wasn't an extended campaign ad or, a feel-good documentary to show to the loyal followers. It was a theatrical release.
Right.
And just shows you the interconnectedness of the Kennedys to Hollywood. Joe Kennedy, of course, had, run a major studio in years prior.
RKO, right?
RKO. He negotiated the rights of the PT 109 book that came out in January 1961, and negotiated the film rights for that book. And then the White House got involved in numerous ways. JFK was given veto power over who would play him. The script ended up being filled with liner notes by JFK as he wrote his commentary, because he insisted that it be portrayed realistically,
Yeah.
as seen through his eyes. And it got right down into some minutia during the production, with the Kennedys looking at the screen tests of the major actors, with Kennedy vetoing a choice of director, and with Kennedy even complaining that Cliff Robertson had his hair parted on the wrong side. So there was a lot of involvement by the subject of this film in this film.
I think I think you like the movie more than I did. In part, the reason that I think this is kind of a mediocre movie is because of the control that you're talking about. I mean, they're very cautious in the way they put this movie together. And what surprises me too is, this is a major movie for Warner Brothers, and yet they didn't really get high quality talent to be in it or to direct it. I mean, the original director, the actual director is Leslie Martinson. I'd never heard of him. And when I looked to see who he was, it's someone who can generously be just characterized as a journeyman TV director, the kind of guy who directs 5 or 6 TV episodes a year for different series. They had originally hired Louis Milestone, which is an equally confounding choice. Milestone was a Hollywood pioneer and the director of All Quiet on the Western Front in 1930, for which he won the Academy Award. That's 33 years earlier. He's a broken down 68-year-old hack when they signed him to direct this. And for some reason, he got kicked off the project after a few weeks, and he was replaced by this guy, Martinson, which means that the movie didn't really have a strong director voice. It was overseen by Jack Warner himself, the head of Warner Brothers, who was also over the hill by 1963. So it's just strange that they didn't put more effort into getting top talent to, produce the movie.
Well, you see that in some of the cast too, and we'll get into the cast later, but you're basically talking about newcomers and staples of TV and film character acting.
Right.
Of course, Cliff Robertson was a star. When you're right, I probably like this movie more than you did, and it will the reasons and the whys and wherefores will become clear as we go along. But understand why I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as a war film, as a war adventure, let me put it that way, and not necessarily as a great delving into the character of John F. Kennedy. He could have been any one of a number of everyman heroes of World War II with the telling of this episode. How did the movie do at the box office?
Well,
I mean, it's Kennedy's.
Exactly. This is what it's kind of a surprise to me, is that as popular as Kennedy was, the movie was kind of not a big flop, but not a success. It was released in June 1963, which is 5 months before the assassination. It had a budget of $4 million, box office at 3.5 million. These are 1963 numbers, so it's a respectable budget, and the $3.5 million box office means it's not exactly a flop, but it's not a hit either. And just for comparison's sake, the top movie of the year was Cleopatra at $26 million, followed by How the West Was Won, and two of my all-time favorites, It's a Mad World and Tom Jones. So they were putting out legitimately good movies that year. The public reaction to this was very muted.
Yeah, and I also recall that in proximity to this release, you had The Longest Day in 1962, which was an extravaganza with every single name actor in Hollywood in it. In 1963, you had The Great Escape, which is also talking about a specific episode in a specific theater of World War II. And that was obviously a much more, attention-getting and artistically, infused film. And just while we're talking about other movies, I have to point out that 1963 saw the release of From Russia with Love,
right?
The second Bond film, and historians believe it's the last film that John Kennedy ever saw. He was a fan of the book, and he was a fan of the movie, and it was his last film.
Yeah, it's not like they couldn't make good movies back then.
Right.
Yeah, it just was. We'll probably get into this maybe more, but they were so treating this with kid gloves and trying to be so respectful, and trying to stick kind of. I mean, we'll talk about the history later, but when you're sort of when the story is has to be told truthfully, it kind of limits what you can do. They glammed it up, or tried to glam it up in a lot of different ways, but
yeah, there was no real room for imagination.
Yeah,
and we've talked about the other movies that we've talked about, the Oliver Stone's Nixon and Spielberg's Lincoln, and obviously Dick, the comedic film about Watergate. There was lots of hypothesized scenes, shall we say.
Yeah.
I think the box office issue, it does need to be pointed out that the run of the movie was interrupted by his death. And I read that the theaters that Warner Brothers pulled the movie for a while because people were a little unsure of what would be seen by the public as trying to exploit the Kennedy death. I mean, we talked about Vaughn Meader. His career was over upon the assassination. And I remember very vividly in the summer of '63, where we summered with my grandmother in our lakefront cottage in New Jersey. They do have lakes in New Jersey. And that album was a big hit. We had the album and it was playing all the time in our family. And the very next summer, the summer of '64, and me being already a political junkie, I went scrounging through the record rack for that album. And I said, "Mom, where's the album?" And she basically looked at me like, "Are you crazy?" And your grandmother threw it out right away.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the, people were feeling their way through this unbelievable tragedy. And I think that interrupted the box office tape.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible you're right. the way they distributed movies was a lot different back then. Again, it was released 5 months before the assassination, and it's possible that over the course of a year, it might have, had more box office appeal. It wasn't like today where everyone goes to see it the first weekend and then, it peters out afterwards. You used to be able to build, but I still think that the public, it didn't get good reviews, and I just think in general the public was not that impressed with it. Tell me, so let's do some likes. What did you like about the movie?
Well, as I said, the main thing I liked about it was almost forgetting it was about John Kennedy and focusing on the story. I thought it was I liked the pacing of the story in this sense. We're told that life in the military and life in wartime are extended periods of boredom and triviality, punctuated by very heightened, dangerous episodes. And that's what you had in this movie. You had lighthearted banter and sort of sometimes cheesy scenes of soldiers griping, soldiers joking, little lighthearted vignettes. And then all of a sudden, people would be getting killed. And it would be real war and real tension. And I liked the ebb and flow of that. I thought there was something really wrong with the music.
All right, we'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
all right, we'll talk about it now. I thought the music was bad. I didn't like the music was bad. Agree. There was too much of it, and they relied on the music to do a lot of work, right? Because they couldn't do it dramatically. There was a lot of music, and it was too much like a Western,
Yeah, it was a very obtrusive score.
And it sounded like the guys who did the music were actually did musics for a lot of Westerns, and they and it sounded like a Western music. And I think that was probably somewhat deliberate in the attempt to make these PT boats the equivalent to cowboys, right? They're, adventurous characters, and they're trying to associate the PT boats with, with cowboys and Indians. So what I liked, I liked that it actually existed. I mean, that's a low bar, but, I never really understood what PT boats were before. I kind of thought that they were like the cigarette boats that George H.W. Bush used to drive, drive like a maniac in Maine. But they're actually bigger, and they have a below deck area. They're 80 feet long, which doesn't really mean anything to me until you see what they are. And when I was watching the movie, I realized that these are the boats that were in McHale's Navy, that Ernest Borgnine sitcom in the mid 60s. So I was familiar with the boats. I just didn't know those were PT boats.
Yeah. You know what surprised me the most about this movie? Where are the women?
Oh, it's got us.
Now, in a lot of war movies, obviously it's a man's world, and you're on a battlefield in those days. But in many war films, they try to find some way to concoct a love affair or a pretty nurse or pictures of loved ones in a wallet of a dead soldier and people mourning that. There was not one single woman in the whole film. And there was, I think, maybe one tangential reference to somebody's family.
Right.
No love letters being, read or written back and forth. The only depiction of a woman was a drawing of a sexy woman that was stumbled upon by Commander Ritchie, and he made a wisecrack out of it.
Right. And everyone was all sort of embarrassed that he had it in his locker, when it's like, of course I'm sure they had stuff like that.
Worse than that.
Worse than that, exactly.
Yeah, he basically said it's the only seaworthy thing he's seen on this boat. But are you kidding me? A Kennedy movie without any women in it?
Well, I actually appreciated that they didn't, try and do anything politically correct, because of course political correctness was not known back then. Well, let's face it, there are no, you know, characters of color either. I mean, they didn't try and pretend that it was anything but a segregated, you know, Navy.
Well, the characters of color were the natives
Right.
that helped rescue. And when they were actually canoeing away with JFK hidden in the bottom of the canoe, they were singing Rock of Ages. So even the entry of the natives, they had a Western,
Right.
missionary. They were obviously affected by missionaries who had converted them to Christianity.
So I did appreciate that it was not obnoxiously hagiographic about JFK. They didn't make him into a saint, which is what I feared. I did not expect that his actual heroism would be so understated. He was much more heroic in real life than you see in the movie. I mean, because they had to truncate the stuff that he did. Are there any other things you liked? Because I got a long list of things I didn't like. Long
Well,
list.
we're going to talk about the actors,
Yeah.
but
All right.
I liked Cliff Robertson. I thought he can carry a movie.
Yeah.
They needed someone substantial enough. What I was concerned about at the beginning was the portrayal of Kennedy, I think, was understated, as you mentioned. At the beginning, it was almost totally passive.
Right.
I mean, he almost had a simpering look on his face. And, but then when he had to get assertive, he got assertive. And I liked that change. I liked the character arc of both Kennedy and Commander Ritchie. I thought that was an interesting, it was a little hokey in the case of Ritchie, but it was an interesting transformation of his character to someone who was all by the book, disrespected these PT guys, disrespected Kennedy, and came to really invest in them and be totally refusing to give up that they were lost, because he was back at the base. So I like that.
I will have something to say about that when we get into the historic versus not historic fact. I actually, there was one more thing that I liked, which is that all the characters in the movie, except for Ritchie, were true characters. I mean, they were given their own names. They played the roles they played. The superior officers, everyone in the movie except for Ritchie, and was an actual person who was there. And so I give them credit for trying to make it as factual as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not. I actually thought the movie was pretty mediocre. I mean, I didn't hate it. I watched it, and maybe I would have liked it more if I hadn't already read up on it. I read this book called Reckless Youth by Nigel Hamilton, which is a very good account of Kennedy's youth up until I think he is in the Senate. It was pretty enthralling, to be honest with you. This was a fascinating and exciting book. And then to get to watch this movie, I just didn't think the director was very good. I didn't think the writers were very good. They couldn't really build tension. But so I didn't like that so much.
Well, I read it. I have not read the book that you read, but I read another book that covers the similar period, and it's the JFK Coming of Age in the American Century book by Frederick Logval. It's the first of 2 volumes, and it covers Kennedy's life up until 1956.
Okay.
And so he goes into detail there about the true history of PT-109.
So, because of the poor writing and direction, I thought the range of human emotions of men at war was kind of flattened. I mean, you thought the banter was good. I thought it was really kind of lame. In real life, when you've got men together, they're always busting each other's chops, but there was just some like lame jabs. And I didn't really feel the terror of combat was expressed like it is in some other war movies from that era.
Well, I think
Disappointing.
I'm not sure if I'm not an expert on war movies. I've seen a number of old school World War II movies. I haven't seen, for example, I haven't seen Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
You may have been spoiled by later, more complex movies like that. Um, because I think a lot of the earlier war movies were probably more superficial. And I agree, this was a superficial war movie, but it still grabbed me in places. When we get to favorite scenes, I'll mention them.
All right. Well, I thought, maybe part of the problem too is that I have seen so many war movies, and seen a lot of these kind of, mediocre paint by numbers movies. And it reminded me a lot about that. I mean, there were good movies back then. From Here to Eternity is a really great movie.
Yeah.
So it's possible to do it. Um, I will, and because was kind of mediocre, I thought that they relied on cliches and movie tropes to create interest. I mean, the worst is, from my perspective, was, in the first half of the movie, there's all these, like out of the blue, there'll be an aerial attack from the Japanese Zeros, and it happens when he's on the battleship going to the base. It happens a couple times when he's on the base. It happens when they're out on the boat. It's like when they think people are getting bored, they'll throw in a Zero will come out of nowhere and start attacking
Yeah,
them.
but that gets to my point of what war is supposedly like. I mean, we haven't been in war. Those periods of boredom,
Yeah.
punctuated by periods of death. And I actually liked that. As I said, I liked that about the movie. I do agree that the lighthearted interregnums between the battle scenes were kind of cheesy. But
Well, Kennedy had such a vibrant personality. He was really, really funny, sharp, smart character. And it's almost like they don't want to show off what an amazing person he was.
How do you know he was amazing then?
Because I read the book. In the book,
Okay.
His they quote what people say about him. They quote his letters. They quote things that he said. And it just didn't come through with the Cliff Robinson character. He was kind of passive.
Right.
But I just want to make one more point about the Japanese planes. I've never understood in the movies why when you get this aerial attack, everyone like runs in a straight line away from the the airplanes, right? They're running away. So, why don't you peel off and go perpendicular to the way, or scatter? Everyone's just running in a straight line, and the bullets are hitting like right next to them, and they never seem to hit them. And then they're diving into a foxhole that's like 2 feet deep, or even 1 foot deep in a couple of cases. They're in these huts, right? No one, the bombers don't know whether there's anyone in their huts, but they get, as soon as the Japanese start attacking, they run out of the huts into the open space, and then they run in a straight line it'd make more sense to run towards the Japanese, the plane. You'd have less time to be, vulnerable. So anyway, that's a movie trope that gets under my skin.
Well, I would just be hiding behind a palm tree or something.
Yeah, right. Don't keep running in the open space. Go right. Go exactly. Go into a palm tree or go into a hut where they don't know you're there. So anyway,
All I can say is, Gary, I hope we don't have any real combat veterans listening to this,
I know,
because they're going to be sitting there thinking, "What a bunch of wusses."
All right. Some other tropes I don't really like. The cowardly soldier who panics, the one who has premonitions of his own death.
Which was true, by the way.
Oh, I know, but it's somehow
that actually happened.
I know.
And I was going to cite that as one of my favorite scenes. Maybe now I'll be too embarrassed to.
All right. And the one I especially objected to was the one that you seem to like. This Commander Ritchie, who has a soft spot for the hero, and that he runs ragged, basically the gruff dad. First of all, it's a cliche, and it didn't happen, which we'll get into. Is there anything is there anything you didn't like?
Well, I mentioned the
music.
overscoring, the musical scoring, and I did think that some of the sing-songy ways that some of their lighthearted banter was portrayed, I didn't like. Because understand, when I say I liked that intermixing, it was the intermixing I liked. I didn't necessarily like the various scenes, and because they weren't talking about women and sex and
right,
and all that, or even about who was left behind at home, I thought that was a perplexing gap. I mean, Kennedy, maybe this is a reason. Kennedy, of course, Jackie was not on the scene yet,
right,
not for a decade yet. Kennedy had a very serious girlfriend named Inga.
Inga Binga.
Yeah, and she
That's
wrote.
what he called her.
Yeah, he wrote letters to her all during his service. Right. She was a journalist, sort of, and ended up writing a very fawning article about his exploits.
Right.
Later on, he wrote her lovelorn letters, but none of that could be in there. So I didn't like that. There was something also about the Technicolor, which was a big thing in the early 60s. That's why people went to the movies, to see everything in brilliant fluorescent colors. And, something about that gave it a more surreal, fake look, a faker look than it really was.
I think, as I kind of mentioned before, I think the problem is it had to be too respectful towards the current president. They were afraid to make him human. They couldn't show any faults. Jack Warner wrote in his autobiography that they, quote, worked diligently to keep everything in good taste and to avoid exploitation of the man in his high office. Well, it's a war film. You can not supposed to have a good taste in a war film. I mean, we put 12 guys together, and even during you couldn't. Even during the 60s, when you had to censor a lot of the language. I mean, you'd have guys. I mean, half of our scatological language and expressions comes from guys who were together in the army. I mean, I didn't want them all swearing or anything, but I thought they could have at least been more, aggressive with each other. And
one of the opening scenes, they make sure to show JFK turning down a cigarette.
Right.
Anyway, he's not even going to take a smoke. And his main concern was getting chocolate bars for all the guys.
Right.
Now, they didn't explain how chocolate bars could possibly survive in the South Pacific without just being goop. That was not explained. But yeah, you're right. You're right.
I mean, they didn't show how, it was kind of miserable back then because it was so hot. Well, the chocolate, I didn't even think about the chocolate bar, but it was miserable, mosquitoes, the whole thing. And
dysentery.
Dysentery, yeah. Of course, I don't really expect them to show people in the latrine, but
Right.
You know, it was tough. They kind of glossed over everything. You know, we usually at this point we usually talk about what the director was trying to accomplish, but that assumes that the director is the auteur of the movie. Um, Given that the director came in at the last minute and Jack Warner took credit for overseeing it, there's no strong voice in this movie. But having said that, what do you think the movie is trying to accomplish? I mean, what is the vision of the movie?
Well, I think it's trying to memorialize and celebrate a life-defining chapter in JFK's life. And we have to look at it as part of a continuum, because JFK, when PT 109 happened, when he was rescued, and when they found out what he had done, this was big news during the war. It was on the front page of the New York Times. Thousands of acts of heroism by individual military during that war. And JFK's exploit gets on the front page of the New York Times with a headline saying Kennedy's son.
Right.
But that's now the reason. It was written up in the Reader's Digest by John Hershey. There was a book, as I mentioned, that was authorized book by Kennedy, authorized by, that came out in 61. In 1962, Jimmy Dean of Big Bad John fame had a top 20 song called PT 109, hit the charts. And it was a schlocky, hokey, kind of sort of country western song by the guy that later became known for Jimmy Dean's Sausage. So all that was a precursor to this movie coming out. So it was just a part of the celebration of what was a life-defining chapter. And I think that was the purpose.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, after the war, there were many, many, many war movies that came out. Some were good, some were critical of the war, some celebrated heroism. And 1963, when this came out, was just 20 years afterwards. I mean, this would be like a movie coming out about the Iraq War.
Right.
And there have been very few movies about that.
What you really see here is the Kennedy network, if you will, taking existing things to a new level. So what's more old hat than candidates for office after World War II, having their brochures show their pictures in uniform? Nixon did it, Kennedy did it, they all did it. And this is simply moving it into multimedia. And I think that was, again, they sort of revolutionized the use of television in campaigns. Now they're taking what was a very tried and true formula of emphasizing a candidate's military exploits and bringing it to a higher plane.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, these movies from these World War II movies all were trying to reflect back to the people that were in the movies and their families what the experience was like. And I think that's what this is trying to do fundamentally. And I mean, once we get past the idea that it was basically a campaign contribution,
Right.
It was the way they were going to try to make the money was a celebration of the ordinary American. Although Kennedy was anything but an ordinary American, but he, I think also there's another line of theme that threads through this, which is, sort of an anti-establishment, anti-bureaucracy sentiment that you see a lot in American literature and American culture. They don't really like the man in a lot of cases. And, Kennedy is sort of pushing against that while also working within the system to be excellent at what he does.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very true. That's a trope, by the way.
Yeah. Oh,
Speaking of
yeah.
tropes,
Yeah.
I mean, not to bring this down to the really, really trivial level, but one of my shows, as you know, is Hogan, favorite shows,
Right.
Hogan's Heroes. Well, they're griping about the brass all the time.
Right.
The Germans are griping about their brass, and Hogan and his gang are griping about the U.S. and the Allied brass. So that's true. What did you think of Cliff Robertson?
I thought he was a little bit bland. I also thought he was old, and I thought it was surprising. I guess in retrospect, it's not surprising, but that they didn't give him any kind of accent at all.
Yeah.
In a movie about Kennedy, the most distinctive thing about him is his accent, the way he talks. And they didn't even attempt. Now, maybe they didn't bother attempt because they wouldn't be good at it, or it wouldn't sound right. But it's just, he's not a very distinctive figure.
Well, actually, what I read was that was an agreement between John Kennedy
Yeah.
and Cliff Robertson that he wouldn't try to do that. That would be too difficult. It would be too sort of obvious. It would be like you're mimicking the president who wasn't president yet, but 20 years hence.
Yeah.
But I thought the cadence of his voice sort of approximated Kennedy's, the way he talked and moved his mouth. I do agree he was bland at the beginning. I think when in the second half of the movie, when he had to lead and when he had to be good in a crisis, which is a big test of leadership, it's not necessarily the day-to-day stuff. Then I thought he became much more assertive, a character.
Yeah.
And but at the beginning, I agree, he was too bland. He was old. He was pushing 40.
Yeah, and the
When
Kennedy
was in his mid to late 20s.
right, 25. Yeah. Well, of
I
course,
thought
that
he
was
was good. I thought he was able to carry the movie. He was a substantive enough actor. He wasn't the first choice, by the way. Jackie, and they wanted Warren Beatty.
Yeah, I think Warren Beatty would have been excellent.
And the reason supposedly Warren Beatty said he wasn't interested, to your point, he hated the script.
Yeah.
He thought the script wasn't good enough. He really ticked off people on the Warner's lot for bad mouthing the movie. And but he and a few others. I know he didn't do a screen test, but Robertson and a few others did screen tests, and they were examined closely by the Kennedys.
So Cliff Robinson went on to win an Oscar for Charlie in 1968, which is how I'm aware of him. Then he kind of disappeared, and then he played Old Ben in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, which is probably how he's best known now. I mean, James Gregory plays Commander Ritchie. He's listed as the chief maintenance officer. It makes him sound like, the way he acts in the movie, though, you think he's commander. So I don't know what he's really supposed to be doing there. He's one of those classic that guy, like, oh, let's get that guy,
He was in a lot of things. And Manchurian Candidate.
Right.
He was the boss in the Dean Martin, Matt Helm series. He was in Barney Miller, the TV show. And, he's been in a lot of these, he'd pop up on a TV episode.
Yeah.
And anything you would turn on. Cliff Robertson was a very hardworking, versatile guy. And he wasn't that choosy. So he would just do anything, basically, to keep busy and keep working. And he wrote and he directed. And he was involved in a big Hollywood scandal.
Right.
The Beagleman, is that how you pronounce it?
I don't know. I thought it was Begelman, but
Begelman maybe. But he discovered that Begelman had forged his, meaning Cliff Robertson's, name on a royalty check or something, or a residual check.
Yeah.
and blew the lid off a big scandal. And the studios blacklisted Robertson.
Right, right.
You would think he'd be a hero.
Uh,
So I thought
um,
he was. I liked him in the movie. And when I say liked, I say that not saying loved. I liked him.
we're still
I
talking
thought
about
he
Cliff
carried it.
Robertson. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I thought Ty Harden, the sidekick, he was the JFK's number two,
Ensign.
Ensign
Yeah.
Tom.
Yeah.
I thought he was striking visually. He had they put beefcake in this movie. So maybe there weren't any love stories, but there was definitely some things for the ladies to be politically correct. But I'm transporting myself to the early 60s. And why would women go to see this movie?
They should have had him with his shirt off more often.
Yeah. But
Apparently, he really was this guy. Ensign Tom was legitimately. They called him like a like a Greek god kind of character with a big blonde beard. It's funny. I was looking at the movie and said, did they actually have beards back then? But apparently, it was true.
he looked very modernistic.
Yeah, right. Because
It
he
looked
had a
like,
goatee kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. And but he was one of there was this sort of exploitative gay talent scout named Henry Wilson, who discovered discovered and groomed Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter.
Right.
He had a stable of those kind of guys.
Okay.
And Ty Harden was one of them.
Okay.
Originally.
I don't know anything about him. Has he been in other stuff?
Well, he was in Western. He played the lead in the Bronco TV series, one of the early Western TV shows, and things like that. And then he really flew off the handle sort of mid-career. He married 8 times. He ended up in prison in Spain once for drugs. He founded a right-wing militia in Arizona. I mean, he was apparently quite a strange guy. But I thought he was good.
Robert Culp was in this movie.
Yes, his debut, I think.
Yeah.
Film debut.
Yeah.
Feature film debut. And again, you could see maybe we're revising history because of what we know. But you could see a star quality, a screen presence by him.
He had more personality than Cliff Robertson, to be honest with you. But
yeah, and he became a TV star for I Spy. He did a great turn in one of the early Man from U.N.C.L.'s. He did 3 great Columbos, where he was the murderer in each one. He was good. I liked him. Robert Blake was in this movie.
Yeah, I didn't notice that until you mentioned it to me.
Yeah, he was one of the early. He played Bucky Harris.
Yeah,
one of the crew. He was a child actor in the Our Gang. He was one of the Our Gang kids. He starred in Beretta, and then he was found not guilty late in life of murdering his wife, but then O.J. Simpson was found liable in a civil suit that came after,
right,
for his wife's death. So again, very very checkered career, and just died recently. I think just a few months ago or last year.
I don't know if your research turned this name up, but apparently George Takei is in this movie.
George Takei, I was going to mention, because
all right.
Anytime you mention something Star Trek, it bumps up our listenership and our viewership. It bumps up every rating on IMDb. Right. I mean, because of the Star Trek crazed fans out there. But George Takei was uncredited, but he was piloting the ship that cut Kennedy's boat in half.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it with the actors. It was sort of a bunch of character actor and TV actors.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's turn to the history for a second, because this is where I have really am going to pontificate. So the movie is really 2 separate movies. It's the the first half where they're introducing the characters and the location and all of that, basically everything that happens in that first half of the movie is fictional. None of
Yeah.
that is, I mean, it's possible that they were bombed by the Japanese, but that doesn't, that doesn't show up in any of the books. But the second half is very true to the story. This actually happened like this. They trunk it. They make it a lot more simplistic. It was, the rescue was more complicated. The surviving was much more complicated. But that part is actually true, and it was chock full of like small details that don't really advance the plot, but are sprinkled in to give a patina of authenticity. I mean, you mentioned Rock of Ages, for example. That was apparently is the only song that those islanders knew how to sing, but where they actually did sing it is at the end when they're all rescued. They were at a party at the base. They came in and they were all drunk and drinking and everything, and the only song the islanders knew how to sing was Rock of Ages. So they were singing this song at this party where everyone's having a blast and exuberant and everything. Instead, in the movie, as you mentioned, they play this Rock of Ages when they're on the boat, on their little canoe. So it's like that kind of, it's like, it's true, but
and then I read that, that little episode where Kennedy accidentally threw the bucket of water on somebody below deck below. That really happened.
Yeah.
That he did do that, just to show you how historians disagree on almost everything. So, the book that I read and to review this history showed that the encounters with the Japanese did happen on his way over. The movie gets wrong the idea of putting the big battle scene where his boat goes out to rescue Marines. In real life, that happened, but it didn't happen till after his episode with 109 had already been finished. In the movie, it's shown as a precursor to the PT 109 episode.
Right.
But it did happen. He did see battles. He saw deaths. He saw action right away. And in fact, this quickly, according to my readings, this quickly soured him on the idea of going to war as an adventure. And that he was very soon, even before he almost died with PT 109, was writing letters saying, okay, I've seen war. I'm like everyone else. We just want to get home. So that's sort of what I read.
Yeah. I think that's correct that he soured on war. I mean, I think that's actually fairly common, and it's also true that he did use his privilege to get into the war in the first place. I mean, he could have avoided it. In fact, they wanted him to stay stateside because he was so smart, such a good leader. They wanted him to be in the general staff. They wanted him to train people. So they, and he had to fight. I mean, Joe Kennedy, Ambassador Joe Kennedy, who was one of the most famous people in America at the time, which is weird for a former, British ambassador. But Joe Kennedy met with the head of the whole PT program and got him into it.
Right.
And he said he just wanted to make sure. He said, according to what I read, this guy Buckley claimed that Kennedy said that his son was going to be president someday, and he wanted to get some publicity out of it, just as long as he didn't send him anyplace too deadly.
Yeah, I read the part about the danger. Kennedy saying, "Don't send him anywhere too risky," but I want him in the program. I didn't read the part about the referencing of the presidency. For one thing, Joe Jr. was still alive. at this time, and he was supposedly the one being groomed. But it was more than one time that John Kennedy had to use family connections, and he almost sensed this push and pull between his influencers. So Joe Kennedy got him into the program, but then he ended up becoming an instructor somewhere.
Right.
And Jack Kennedy got mad, so he went and met with a senator.
Right.
And then to get something better than that, and ended up in Panama. And so then he ended up going to Honey Fitz, his maternal grandfather, who then sat down with another senator to get him to the South Pacific. So this is a case where the family strings were pulled incredibly, but what makes it so interesting is it was not pulled to get out of anything.
I know.
It was pulled to get into something.
And that's the kind of thing that they don't really get into, and I can understand why they don't, because they don't want to emphasize, his his ability to influence and pull strings, but it's a very interesting character. It's a very interesting thing that Kennedy did. That they leave out.
So what did your historians say as speculation as to the reasons for he wanted to get there?
I think, getting psychological, I think he was a little tired of they blame it a lot on his mother, who was very overbearing and rules-based. He wanted to get and do something exciting in his life. He was I think he was a high testosterone guy who wanted to actually experience life and danger and all that kind of stuff. I don't think he did it for political reasons. I think he did it because he just wanted to, many. I mean, you and I can't even imagine this because we've grown up in a different time, but people were, every time we have wars, guys are always trying to enlist, even though they're 16 years old and they're faking their ages and all that kind of stuff. The guys are desperate to get into the war. F. Scott Fitzgerald could not wait to go overseas and get into World War I. So I think that's what was going on. I mean, what did you hear?
Yeah, that's what I read, that there wasn't something so concrete as to say, well, I better do this so that I can run for office in the future. That wasn't it. And first of all, you didn't need to be in a really dangerous place to claim to show your war service bona fides. So that wasn't it. That it was more that he romanticized the PT boats. It was something that he had a chance of commanding on his own. There was a swashbuckling image to those boats, and he liked that. And then the history I read speculated that he was probably pretty caught up in the actual struggle, the cause, that this was total war against totalitarianism.
Well, he had written this book while England slept, and quite a few people in the book that I read mentioned how he understood the geopolitical situation, and he had a big grasp of what was going on in the world. And all the men were very impressed with his intellect on top of his courage and his personality and everything else. So he did do that. The other thing, there was
some. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing that's left out of him getting into the PT program is he never should have been anywhere near it because his health was so bad.
That's right. If there were strings pulled, if there were strings pulled in terms of unfair advantage, it was probably that his health was terrible. I think there was also sibling rivalry involved, maybe a chance to make his mark with so much attention being heaped upon Joe Jr. And it worked in the other direction, as it turned out, sadly.
Yeah.
Because Joe Jr. had to read the front page of the New York Times about his younger brother's heroism, and watch him be feted when he came back home. And that led him to want to push for more dangerous assignments, of his own and ended up, in his death.
So another historical error, it's not really an error as much as an error of omission, is that the PT boats were not very effective at all. I mean,
Right.
they were a PR campaign more than anything. The only reason the PT boat got off to any kind of life was because they were so easy to make in the very beginning of the war. They were made out of wood. They could churn these things out, and it was basically the only thing the Navy had going for it. And of course, it was a PT boat that rescued MacArthur, General MacArthur, off of Corregidor. So, and then the guy who's in the program, the head of the program, was a PR genius and just went around and talked about him. So,
Right.
it's left out how totally what a failed program it was. Like even in the night of this particular attack, when these 16 boats go out, they shot off 30 torpedoes, and not one of them hit a ship.
Yeah. Well, James Michener called them suicide boats.
Yeah.
That they were. It was a dangerous place to be, and there's some questions about Kennedy's seamanship have come up, but he had his engines in idle. He only had one engine running. He was unable to really even have a chance to avoid the collision, and he stalled out the engines when he tried to. But this is minor stuff, I think.
No, and also, I mean, we wouldn't going to get into it, but they glamorize, this movie glamorizes PT boats in a way that they don't really deserve. Other than I'm sure the men who served were very heroic for going
Right.
into these things. But the strategy, like they put these 16 boats out, only 4 of them had radar. They couldn't communicate at night because they didn't want to, so they had to communicate.
Yes.
Pitch black.
Yeah.
The idea that you have this little boat that it's going to go up to a destroyer and shoot it and with a torpedo means that you have to be so secretive. And they should have gone off one at a time instead of trying to go 4 together and 16.
Yeah.
Anyway. So my last history thing is this: the thing that I objected to the most and really hated about the movie is this. They actually did not go out and search for him because his commander was a jerk, really. He's a terrible person. And this guy, Ritchie, is a fictionalized, whitewashed version of the commander who was really bad. So Kennedy was really pissed that when he got back, that no one went and searched for him. So
yeah, I read that too, that it was almost of scandal proportions. It was scandalous.
Yeah.
The failure to really search. Yeah.
Well, and Admiral Halsey, who's in charge of the Navy, actually sent because of pressure from Washington, sent word, go search for this boat, and the commander refused to do it. So they left all of that out of the movie for obvious reasons. They don't want to, make the Navy look bad, but that was scandalous. All right, favorite scenes.
Well, I've got just one I'll mention, and that is when they were rescuing the Marines, and the Marines were scrambling aboard the PT boat, climbing up the net. And I thought there was quite a bit of suspense and dread, and really showing the randomness of war, of waiting to see which Marine next would get shot in the back,
right,
and which Marine would make it over the top to safety. And to me, I thought it was really well done. And then right after that, they ran out of gas, and it was eerily silent, and they were inexorably going closer to shore, where the Japanese were at the ready to blow them out of the water. I thought that sequence was quite well done. And that's what I mean when I say that I appreciated this movie as a war movie.
I thought that scene was good too. I also thought the sinking scene was fine. When he's out trying to rescue everyone. I thought the scene at the end where his 5 men show up to go out with him again, I thought was very emotional. So I like those scenes. I didn't, I didn't like too many other scenes. My least favorite scene was when they have this Commander Ritchie go out on the boat and he shoots down a Japanese Zero. I mean, that was very corny and again, not historical at all because the actual commander wouldn't go out on a PT boat, would never go out on
Yeah,
PT boats. You got any
yeah,
favorite lines?
yeah. I think, and you probably think this is too Hollywood schlocky,
Yeah.
but toward the end, when one of the would-be mutineers, one of the guys that openly talked about maybe we should surrender to the Japanese, because, instead of waiting to get shot or starving to death. And after the rescue worked, he went up sort of tearfully to JFK and apologized to JFK for having doubts, for sort of what he probably perceived in himself as showing some cowardice. And JFK said basically, quote, I like men who say what they believe.
I thought I don't have any favorite lines from the movie, but what I do have favorite lines from is from books. First time that Kennedy is picked up and brought back to the camp to pick up the boat that's going to come rescue his men, he had to wait a long time. And he's really pissed when the boat finally gets there. And he's just snapping at them and saying, what took so long? And they ask him if he wants to have something to eat before he leaves. And he says, no, thanks. I just had a coconut. Because they had to stay alive by eating 5 days.
Right.
The way they were able to stay alive was by eating and drinking coconut. And there was a good line from Rose Kennedy, believe it or not. She wrote in a family letter, she wrote, Jack thinks it would be good for his brother Joe's political career if he died for the grand old flag, although I don't believe he feels it is absolutely necessary.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
I know Rose.
Yeah.
Rose get doing the, all right. So
do you think this has any relevance for today, this movie? Or does it make you think about the way things are today?
Well, it does make me feel like this is a straightforward patriotic movie in which the president of the United States is the hero. And we don't get very many straightforward patriotic movies anymore. Although I'll note that Top Gun Maverick was very pro-military, was the biggest box office hit of the last year. So maybe Hollywood would take note of that, that there's patriotism in the country. So I'm sorry we don't see more movies like this, even though, I don't think it's a very good movie, but I'm sorry we don't see more patriotic movies.
Yeah, I think it harkens back to a time that we've obviously lost, which is that once somebody became president, it was a person that could be looked up to, regardless of party. It didn't even necessarily mean you would vote for that president
Right.
the next time around, but there was a veil or an aura of respect that came around a president. Now, approval ratings in the 30s and 40s are normal for presidents, even presidents that get relatively easily reelected, like Obama, for example. But Eisenhower, for his whole 8 years, averaged 65% Gallup approval. Kennedy, 70% average. So this was before he was lionized as a martyr in death. And I think we've lost that, just the idea that the president is somebody you could look up to, that would cross party lines.
Do you think it could be made today?
Well, no. I think, for one thing, presidents involved in wars are becoming a rarer and rarer thing. There either wasn't a war or they got out of it somehow. They might have made one about John McCain if he had become president. There's more distrust and mean-spiritedness now, so I don't think you would do that. I think there would be outrage as in terms of it's an illegal campaign contribution.
Yeah.
So I don't think you would see a theatrical release glorifying a president now, but you certainly would see and you do see glorifying films made of candidates and presidents. It would just be done under the aegis of a campaign or a convention film, those kind of films. You wouldn't see a major theatrical release.
I think you're right about that. It's a bad business model, because half the country is not gonna want to go to the movie, and it's hard.
Right.
Yeah. I would also say that, but I would like to see someone remake PT 109 and actually make it accurate to what it was actually like, and showing Kennedy what he was really like. And I think it would make a good.
That's a good idea.
Make a good movie.
Yeah, and delving into the politics prior to getting to the South Pacific.
How would you? Yeah, exactly. I mean, just showing him, conniving to get in, would be really, really interesting.
Yeah.
I would give this movie a C grade.
Okay. I give it a B+.
Okay.
On the grounds that it was a decent war adventure
Okay.
movie, and there was suspense and there was some conflict in it.
All right. And if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
No, because it doesn't relate to any policy decision of Kennedy as president. What I would do is try to find a movie about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
That would make a lot more sense in terms of teaching students about a huge event in history. If you want to do World War II, you pick another movie.
I might show it to ninth graders, not to seniors, just because an interesting thing of what the war was like. All right,
Gary, you made it. You made it through a John Fitzgerald Kennedy movie, being very fair-minded and open and objective. So I'm proud of you.
Well,
as a
I have
Massachusetts boy having to talk about a Kennedy.
Well, I have to say that you have influenced me once again by making me open my mind to Kennedy. And I will say that rereading this movie, rereading this book, Reckless Youth, gave me a really very good impression of Kennedy in the war, at least. I mean, he really was an extraordinary person, and it's no surprise that he became the youngest president, except for Theodore Roosevelt, who was also an extremely, amazing person. So,
look, like him or like his policies or not, or all the imagery, we grew up on the idea, as I think Republicans, that he was a trivial dilettante of a figure. I mean, he was a substantive figure before becoming president.
Yeah, no,
he was
yeah. All right. So, we made it through another podcast here, which I'm going to remind everyone is still available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon. So please go and subscribe to these things. We'll be back soon with another edition of The Celluloid President.
This shows a rate of economic growth, and therefore it is not with too much concern that I say a raise from 25 to 35 is not completely out of accord when compared with the current financial deficit on hand. Now, I trust that answers your question about your weekly allowance, Caroline. Next question.
Yes, I should like to ask a question about...
Would you stand, please?
Yes, I should like to ask a question about...
Would you identify yourself, please?
I'm your wife. And I should like to ask the following question.
No, speak English, Jackie.
I noticed that you didn't touch your salad either at dinner tonight or at dinner last night. Would you tell us why, please?
Well, let me say this about that. Now, number one, in my opinion, the fault does not lie as much with the salad as it does with the dressing being used on the salad. Now, let me say that I have nothing against the dairy industry. However, I would prefer it if in the future we stuck to coleslaw. Next question. Yes, the baby in the back row, baby John. Well, I believe I answered that question at dinner last night. Now, if you remember, here is what I said at that time. Oodie waddy body biddy doo, waddy da, goody waddy woo. Yes. Next question.
Yes, I should like to ask a question regarding the daily bath.
Identify yourself, please.
I'm the house nurse.
All right, nurse. Move ahead with your question.
Well, there seems to be some confusion as to the toys to be taken into the bathtub. Now, Caroline's toys are getting mixed up with John's. And I should like to know once and for all whose toys are who.
Yes, well, let me make a judgment about that now. The following toys have been appropriated for tub use. 18 PT boats, three Yogi Bear beach balls, 2 Howdy Doody plastic bouncing clowns, a ball of silly putty, and a rubber swan. Now, let me make a judgment on the dispersal of these items. 9 of the PT boats, 2 of the Yogi Bear beach balls, the ball of silly putty belong to Caroline. 9 of the PT boats, 1 of the Yogi Bear beach balls, and the 2 Howdy Doody plastic bouncing clowns are Baby John's. The rubber swan is mine.